The bell above the diner door didn't chime, it choked. It was a miserable Tuesday morning, the kind that smelled of wet asphalt, stale grease, and regret. Ayan wanted black coffee, nothing more. But when his scarred, calloused fingers dug into empty leather pockets, he found himself staring down a disgruntled minimum wage barista. Then came the slide of copper and silver across the scratched formica counter. A kid, no taller than his kneecap, paying for a Hell's Angels caffeine fix. And it pissed him off. The rain in Seattle didn't fall. It existed. It hung in the air, a permanent freezing mist that seeped through denim, leather, and eventually bone. Ayan hated the rain. He hated the way it made his blown-out left knee ache, a dull, rhythmic throb that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He pushed the heavy glass door of Hank's grill open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick. It smelled of burnt coffee grounds, frying onions left over from the night shift, and the harsh chemical bite of cheap floor cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering erratically and casting a sickly, jaundiced glow over the empty booths. Ayan stepped onto the linoleum, his heavy combat boots squeaking wetly. He was a mountain of a man, wide-shouldered and thick-necked, wrapped in a rain-slicked leather cut. The winged death head patch on his back was heavy, sodden with water, clinging to his spine. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a threat. His beard was graying and unkempt, his face a map of deep-set lines and faded scars. He wiped the rainwater from his eyes with the back of a massive tattooed hand and lumbered toward the counter. Behind the register stood a kid who couldn't have been older than 19. He had a patchy excuse for a mustache, heavy bags under his eyes, and an expression that screamed he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. His name tag hung crookedly on a mustard-stained apron. Kyle. Large black, Ayan rumbled. His voice was gravel grinding in a cement mixer. 2 sugars. Don't stir it. Kyle didn't look up from the register. He just punched the keys with a lazy, heavy finger. 285. Ayan nodded, reaching into the inner pocket of his heavy denim jacket beneath the leather vest. His fingers met the rough fabric of the lining. Nothing. He frowned, a subtle tightening of the muscles around his jaw. He shifted his weight, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his knee, and dug into his front jeans pocket. A lone guitar pick, a crumpled receipt from a gas station in Portland. Lint. The heat began to creep up the back of Ayan's neck. It was a familiar, ugly sensation. He was a man who operated on respect, on fear, on the unspoken rule that he took what he needed and paid his debts. Standing at a diner counter with empty pockets felt like standing naked in the snow. He checked his back pockets. Empty. "Forgot my wallet," Ayan muttered, his voice dropping half an octave. He looked at Kyle, expecting the kid to just wave it off. He was a regular somewhat. He'd been here twice this week. Kyle finally looked up. His eyes dragged over the leather cut, the club patches, the sheer, imposing bulk of the man in front of him. But the teenager didn't look intimidated. He just looked exhausted and deeply annoyed. "I already poured it, man." Ayan stared at the styrofoam cup sitting on the counter, steam curling lazily from the drinking hole. "I said I forgot my wallet. Keep the coffee." "Manager's riding my ass about waste," Kyle said, his voice flat, devoid of any customer service polish. "If I ring it and void it, it comes out of my tips. I don't make enough tips for you to just forget your wallet." Ayan's jaw clenched. The muscles in his forearms bunched beneath his sleeves. He didn't want to fight a teenager over $3, but his pride was a fragile, volatile thing. He leaned forward, resting his massive knuckles on the formica counter. The silence in the diner thickened, the humming of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounding incredibly loud. "I told you," Ayan said softly, dangerously. "I ain't got it. You want to take it out of my hide, Kyle?" Kyle swallowed hard, the bravado slipping for a fraction of a second, but before he could formulate a response, a sound broke the tension. It was a small, sharp clink. Ayan snapped his head down. A tiny hand, pale and streaked with something that looked like dried mud, was resting on the counter right next to his knuckles. He turned his head. Standing there was a little girl. She was maybe 7, drowning in a faded, oversized pink puffy jacket that had seen better decades. The zipper was broken, safety pinned near her throat. Her blonde hair was a rat's nest of tangles, plastered to her forehead with rain. Ayan hadn't even heard her walk up. He prided himself on his situational awareness, a byproduct of living 30 years in a violent world. But she had slipped out of the corner booth like a ghost. She didn't look at Ayan. She was staring intently at the counter. Clink, clink, clink. She was carefully, methodically stacking coins onto the sticky formica. Ayan stared at the coins. Pennies, mostly. They were dark and sticky, the kind you find wedged deep in the cushions of a thrift store couch. There were 3 nickels, oxidized to a dull, flat gray, and a single miraculously shiny quarter. Finally, she produced a $1 bill. It was crumpled, torn at the corner, and soft as tissue paper. She smoothed it out with deliberate, agonizing slowness, her small fingers pressing the creases flat against the counter. "There," she said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the shrill energy most kids her age possessed. It was a flat, matter-of-fact tone. Ayan looked from the pile of change to the girl, then back to the change. His brain stalled. This wasn't how his world worked. In his world, weakness was punished, debts were collected with interest, and nobody gave anything away for free. "What's this?" Ayan growled, stepping back from the counter as if the pile of change was radioactive. The girl finally looked up at him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. They didn't hold fear, which unsettled him deeply. Most adults crossed the street when they saw him walking. This kid just stared at him like he was a slightly inconvenient piece of furniture. "It's for the coffee," she said. She pointed a small, dirty finger at the steaming styrofoam cup. Ayan felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation. It burned in his chest, a hot, defensive anger. He was a Hell's Angel. He rode a 90 cubic inch Harley Davidson. He had broken a man's jaw in 3 places over a bad poker hand in Bakersfield. He did not need a 7-year-old taking pity on him. It was humiliating. It was pathetic. "Put your money away, kid," Ayan snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. It echoed in the empty diner. "I don't need your charity." The girl didn't flinch. She just kept staring at him, her pale eyes unblinking. "He said he had to pay for it if you didn't," she pointed at Kyle. "My mom says it's not fair to make people pay for things they didn't do." Kyle, sensing an out, quickly swept the coins and the soft dollar bill off the counter and into his hand. He didn't bother counting it. He just dumped it into the open register drawer and slammed it shut. "Paid," Kyle muttered, sliding the coffee cup toward Ayan. "Hey!" Ayan slammed his hand on the counter, making Kyle jump. "I told you I didn't want it." "Too late," Kyle said, turning his back to wipe down the espresso machine. Ayan turned his wrath back to the girl, but she was already walking away. She didn't look back. She shuffled back to the corner booth, her oversized pink jacket swishing around her knees. She slid into the vinyl seat next to a woman who looked like a hollowed-out version of the girl. The mother. She had dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back into a tight, greasy ponytail. She was staring blankly at a cold cup of water, her fingers tracing the rim. Ayan stood at the counter, his massive hands hovering awkwardly by his sides. He looked down at the coffee. It smelled good. He was freezing. His knee throbbed. He picked up the cup. The heat bled through the cheap styrofoam, warming his calloused palm. It felt heavy. Heavier than a cup of coffee had any right to be. He walked over to his usual booth by the window, sliding his large frame into the squeaking vinyl. He set the coffee down and just stared at it. He didn't drink it right away. He felt a weird, crawling sensation beneath his skin. It wasn't gratitude. Ayan didn't do gratitude. It was a disruption of the natural order. A debt had been incurred. In his life, debts were the currency of survival. You do for me, I do for you. You screw me, I bury you. It was a clean, brutal arithmetic. But this? This broke the math. A little girl in a ragged coat had just bought him a coffee with the contents of a piggy bank. Why? Because she thought he looked tired? Because her mother taught her fairness? It made no sense. It was irrational, sloppy human behavior, and Ayan hated sloppy. He finally took a sip. It was awful. Scalding hot, bitter, with the metallic aftertaste of poorly filtered water. He drank half of it in one gulp, letting the burn distract him from the sudden tightness in his chest. He looked across the diner. The girl was sitting quietly. Her mother hadn't noticed the interaction at the counter. The woman looked completely checked out, staring at the rain lashing against the window pane. The girl wasn't eating. There was no food on their table, just the 2 glasses of tap water. Ayan watched them. He noted the way the mother's coat was frayed at the cuffs, the way the little girl kept her hands tucked into her armpits for warmth, the worn-down, paper-thin soles of the mother's cheap canvas shoes. He finished the coffee, crushing the styrofoam cup in his hand until it squeaked and cracked. He tossed it onto the table and stood up. He needed to get out of there. He needed to get back on his bike, smell the exhaust, feel the vibration of the engine, and forget this entire pathetic morning. He pushed out the door, the bell choking once again. Outside, the rain had picked up. It was a heavy, relentless downpour that drummed against the pavement like 1,000 impatient fingers. Ayan walked to his bike, a massive, matte black Road King parked diagonally across 2 spots. He threw his heavy leg over the leather seat, ignoring the shooting pain in his joint. He reached down, turned the ignition, and hit the starter. The engine roared to life, a deep guttural thunder that rattled the windows of the diner. It was a comforting sound. It was control. It was power. He sat there for a minute, letting the engine idle, the vibration humming up through the frame and into his bones. He pulled his thick leather gloves on, flexing his stiff fingers. He was ready to dump the clutch and tear out of the lot, heading back to the clubhouse where things made sense, where men drank cheap beer, punched each other over pool games, and didn't accept pennies from children. But he didn't put it in gear. Through the rain-streaked visor of his helmet, he saw the diner door open. The mother and the girl walked out into the downpour. They didn't have an umbrella. The mother instantly hunched her shoulders, pulling the thin collar of her coat up around her neck. The girl just pulled the hood of her oversized pink jacket over her head, though it was so big it immediately flopped down over her eyes. She had to push it back up with a pale hand to see where she was going. They didn't walk toward the parking lot. They turned left, heading down the cracked sidewalk alongside the busy arterial road. Ayan watched them. The water was pooling in the gutters, rushing in muddy torrents past the curb. Every time a car sped by, it sent a spray of dirty water onto the sidewalk. The mother grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her closer to the brick wall of the diner to avoid the splash. They were walking in this weather. Ayan revved the engine, the sound violently loud in the gray morning. "Just drive away, Ox," he told himself. "Not your circus, not your monkeys. You got a coffee. Big deal. Toss $3 in a charity bin tomorrow." He shifted into first gear with a heavy clunk. He pulled out of the parking lot, the rear tire spinning slightly on the wet asphalt before catching traction. He turned right, intending to head toward the highway. Instead, he found his left hand squeezing the clutch, his right foot hovering over the rear brake. The bike slowed to a crawl. He looked in his rearview mirror. Through the distortion of the rain, he could see the 2 small, pathetic figures shrinking in the distance. The girl's pink jacket was a tiny, vibrant blotch against the bleak gray cityscape. Ayan cursed out loud, a harsh, foul string of words that got lost inside his helmet. He slammed his foot down, dragging the bike into a U-turn right in the middle of the road, ignoring the blaring horn of an oncoming delivery truck. He accelerated back the way he came, slowing down as he approached the sidewalk where the mother and daughter were walking. He didn't pull up next to them. He didn't want to scare the mother. He just trailed them, keeping about 50 yards back, idling his massive motorcycle in the right lane with his hazard lights flashing. Cars honked and swerved around him, drivers shooting him angry glares, but one look at the sheer size of him and the club patch on his back usually kept them moving. He watched them walk. It was a painful, agonizingly slow procession. The girl's stride was short, forcing her to practically jog every few steps to keep up with her mother's exhausted, shuffling pace. Ayan's mind was a mess of conflicting instincts. He was angry at himself for caring, angry at the girl for making him care, and inexplicably angry at the mother for letting her kid walk in the freezing rain. But underneath the anger, buried deep beneath layers of cynicism and leather, was a sharp, biting memory. He remembered being 7. He remembered a cold apartment in Gary, Indiana. He remembered the feeling of water seeping through the holes in his sneakers because his old man drank the shoe money away. He remembered the hollow, gnawing ache in his stomach that felt like a living thing trying to eat him from the inside out. He hadn't thought about that in decades. He had built a life, a persona, a wall of violence and brotherhood to ensure he never felt that weak, that small, ever again. And yet, watching this kid trudge through the puddles, he felt a ghost of that old chill in his toes. They walked for 6 blocks, 6 long, miserable blocks through an industrial district that was slowly rotting away. Finally, they turned into the parking lot of a motel. It was a dive. The neon sign near the road was shattered, reading only STWNDSMTL. The stucco siding was peeling off in large, scab-like chunks, revealing rotting wood underneath. The parking lot was full of deep potholes filled with murky water. The doors to the rooms opened right to the outside, painted a depressing, chipped teal. Ayan pulled his bike over to the curb across the street and killed the engine. The sudden silence, save for the patter of rain on his helmet, was deafening. He put his boot down and watched. The mother fumbled with a physical key, not a key card, an actual brass key, shoving it into the lock of room 114. She had to kick the bottom of the door hard to get it to unstick from the swollen frame. They disappeared inside, the door slamming shut behind them. Ayan sat on his bike for a long time. The rain was finding its way through the seams of his gear, running down his neck in icy rivulets. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crushed pack of Marlboros. He managed to light one, shielding the flame with his heavy glove. He took a drag, the harsh smoke filling his lungs. He looked at room 114. The curtains were drawn tightly shut. There was no car parked in front of it. $2.85. That was the debt. Ayan blew a stream of smoke out into the rain. He knew, with absolute terrifying certainty, that dropping $3 at their door wouldn't balance this ledger. He kicked the kickstand down. The motel office smelled like stale cigarette smoke, wet dog, and artificial pine air freshener trying desperately to mask both. The door chimed with a cheap electronic melody as Ayan pushed it open, water dripping heavily from the hem of his leather cut onto the cracked linoleum floor. Behind bulletproof glass stood a man who looked exactly like the kind of guy who managed a rotting roadside motel. He was thin, sallow, wearing a stained yellow polo shirt stretched over a protruding, hard-looking gut. He was picking his teeth with a matchbook cover, his eyes glued to a small, fuzzy television mounted in the corner playing a daytime judge show. He didn't bother looking up when the door chimed. "Check-in ain't till 3, the manager mumbled around the cardboard in his teeth. Ayan didn't say anything. He just walked to the transaction tray beneath the glass and stood there. The sheer mass of him blocked out the weak gray light coming through the dirty front windows. Water pooled off his boots. He breathed in a slow, heavy intake of air that rustled the wet leather of his jacket. The silence dragged out, heavy and expectant. The manager finally tore his eyes away from the TV, annoyance flashing across his pale face. The annoyance died the second he registered what was standing on the other side of the glass. The manager's eyes snagged on the thick silver chains hanging from Ayan's belt, then traveled up the scarred, broad chest, lingering on the 1%er diamond patch sewn onto the damp leather. He swallowed the matchbook cover by mistake and started violently coughing. Ayan waited for the man to finish hacking. "Room 114. Ayan said. The gravel in his voice scraped against the tight confines of the office. Who's in it? The manager pounded his chest, his eyes watering. I can't give out guest information, man. Policy. Ayan didn't blink. He just stared. He didn't threaten the man. He didn't need to. He just let his presence fill the room, a looming, immovable object of bad intentions. He slowly reached into his inner pocket. The manager flinched, taking a half step back from the glass, but Ayan only pulled out his crushed pack of Marlboros. He tapped one out, clamped it between his teeth, and lit it. The flare of the Zippo illuminated the deep, shadowed creases of his face. Policy, Ayan repeated, puffing a cloud of gray smoke at the glass. Right. Let's talk policy. The health department got a policy about black mold in the vents? Because I can smell it from the parking lot. How about the fire marshal? Think he likes those exposed wires hanging over the ice machine? The manager's Adam's apple bobbed. He wiped a sweaty palm on his stained pants. Look, buddy, I don't want no trouble. It's just a woman and her kid, Selena and little Carrie. That's it. No guys coming in and out, no drug traffic. They're quiet. How long they been here? A month, the manager said defensively. But they're out tomorrow. I'm locking the door at noon. They're a week behind on the weekly rate. I let it slide because of the kid, but I got an owner breathing down my neck. I ain't running a charity. Charity? The word tasted like ash in Ayan's mouth. It reminded him of the copper coin sliding across the diner counter. Ayan took a deep drag of his cigarette. He hated this. He hated feeling obligated to strangers. He hated the tight, uncomfortable knot sitting high in his chest. It felt like indigestion, but he knew it was guilt. It was a useless, dangerous emotion. He reached toward his back pocket, not the empty one he'd checked at the diner, but a hidden slit pocket sewn into the lining of his heavy denim jeans. It was his emergency stash, bail money, gas money for when he needed to disappear across a state line at 3 a.m. He pulled out a folded wad of cash. The bills were slightly damp, smelling of sweat and old denim. He peeled off 4 crisp $100 bills. He slid them through the curved metal dip beneath the glass. The manager stared at the money like it was a live rattlesnake. What's this? 2 weeks' rent for 114, Ayan said flatly, and a little extra for you to keep your mouth shut. Rent is only $250 a week, the manager stammered, his eyes darting between the cash and Ayan's impassive face. Then the rest buys them some peace and quiet, Ayan rumbled. Nobody knocks on their door. Nobody tells them they have to leave. And if she asks who paid, you tell her the church down the street has a voucher program. You tell her anything but the truth. You understand me? The manager's hand darted out, snatching the bills with greedy, nicotine-stained fingers. Yeah, absolutely. Voucher program. Got it. Or, if I come back here in 2 weeks and find out you pocketed this and threw them out, Ayan added, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried perfectly through the thick glass. I won't call the fire marshal. I'll just bring my own matches. The manager nodded frantically, the color draining entirely from his face. Ayan turned on his heel and pushed out the door, the cheap chime mocking him on the way out. He stepped back into the freezing rain, cursing himself with every step back to his motorcycle. He was an idiot. $400 down the drain for a cup of terrible diner coffee. The ledger was unbalanced again. Now he was the one in the red. He didn't go back to the clubhouse. Instead, the Road King rumbled through the wet, gray streets until it swung into the parking lot of a discount supermarket. It was a bleak warehouse-style building with flickering neon letters, half of which were burned out so it just read FODMRT. Walking through the sliding doors, the temperature felt colder inside than it did out in the rain. The air smelled of old cardboard, overripe bananas, and cheap bleach. Ayan grabbed a rusty shopping cart. One of the wheels was locked tight, forcing him to push it at a rigid, awkward angle that sent a jolt of pain up his bad knee with every step. He felt entirely out of place. He was surrounded by exhausted mothers wrangling toddlers. elderly couples comparing the prices of canned beans, and solitary men buying frozen dinners. And then there was him, a massive, soaked biker with a scowl that could curdle milk, aggressively pushing a squeaky cart down the cereal aisle. He didn't know what kids ate. He didn't know what women who lived in cheap motels needed. He just grabbed what made sense for survival: density, calories, shelf life. He tossed in 2 heavy loaves of cheap white bread, 3 jars of generic peanut butter, 2 jars of strawberry jelly. He moved to the canned goods aisle, sweeping 6 cans of beef stew and 4 cans of generic spaghetti rings into the basket. The metal cans clattered violently against the wire cart, drawing nervous glances from a woman comparing soup labels nearby. Ayan ignored her. He grabbed a plastic crate of mandarin oranges, boxed macaroni and cheese, a heavy plastic jug of apple juice. As he walked past the deli section, he grabbed 2 thick plastic-wrapped blocks of cheddar cheese and a pound of sliced ham. He reached the checkout lane. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, didn't make eye contact as she scanned the items. The total came to $68. Ayan paid in cash, ignoring the way her hands trembled slightly as she handed him his change. He bagged the groceries himself, double-bagging the heavy plastic to ensure they wouldn't tear. Walking back out to his bike, he realized the logistical nightmare of transporting 4 heavy grocery bags on a motorcycle in the rain. He spent 10 minutes in the parking lot, using thick bungee cords from his saddlebags to strap the plastic bags precariously to the passenger backrest and the chrome luggage rack. It looked ridiculous. A terrifying matte black machine built for speed and intimidation, currently hauling peanut butter and canned stew like a suburban minivan. He rode back to the motel slowly, sticking to the right lane, paranoid that a bump would send a jar of jelly shattering onto the highway. The rain was beginning to let up, transitioning from a heavy pour to a steady, miserable drizzle by the time he pulled back onto the street overlooking the motel. He didn't pull into the lot. The Harley was too loud. It would draw attention. He parked a block away, behind a rusted-out dumpster belonging to a closed-down auto shop. He killed the engine, the sudden quiet rushing back into his ears. He unstrapped the bags, his thick fingers clumsy with the cold and wet bungee cords. Carrying 2 bags in each massive hand, Ayan walked the block back to the motel. He stayed close to the overgrown bushes lining the property, moving with a surprising quietness for a man of his size. He kept his eyes on the peeling teal door of room 114. The lot was empty. The manager was nowhere to be seen. Ayan stepped onto the concrete walkway outside the room. The smell of damp earth and rotting wood was stronger here. He carefully lowered the 4 plastic bags onto the welcome mat, which was just a piece of frayed, dirty carpet. He stood up straight. His knee popped, a loud, sharp crack in the damp air. He froze, waiting to see if the noise had alerted them. Nothing. He raised his hand, curling his fingers into a heavy fist. He hesitated. For a split second, he thought about just walking away, but the food contained perishables. The cheese and ham would spoil if they sat out here all day. He knocked. 3 loud, rapid, heavy thuds against the cheap wood. The door rattled in its frame. Ayan didn't wait. He immediately turned and walked fast, his heavy boots eating up the concrete walkway. He rounded the corner of the building, pressing his broad back against the damp stucco wall of the ice machine alcove. He was out of sight, but he had a clear view of the walkway through the gap between the building and the vending machine. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. Then, the sound of a deadbolt sliding back. The door creaked open, the hinges groaning in protest. It wasn't the mother. It was Carrie. She stood in the doorway, still wearing that oversized pink jacket, though she had taken the hood down. Her messy blonde hair stuck up in weird directions. She peered out into the gray afternoon, looking left, then right. She didn't see Ayan. Then she looked down. She stared at the 4 bulging plastic bags. She didn't touch them. She just stood there perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. "Mom?" Her small voice drifted through the damp air. It wasn't a yell. It was a confused, urgent whisper. "Mom, come here." The door opened wider. Selena appeared. She looked worse than she had at the diner. Her face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion. She leaned against the doorframe, looking like a strong breeze would knock her over. "What is it, Carrie? I told you to keep the door." Selena stopped. She saw the bags. Ayan watched from the shadows, his breathing shallow. He expected her to look around, to call out. He expected her to be suspicious. In his world, a free gift was always a trap. It was bait. But Selena didn't look for a trap. She slowly sank to her knees right there on the dirty concrete walkway. She reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the top of one of the bags open. The yellow label of a peanut butter jar and the bright red foil of the coffee canister peeked out. Selena's hands dropped to her lap. Her shoulders hitched. She didn't cry beautifully. It was an ugly, sudden collapse. She buried her face in her hands, her thin shoulders shaking violently beneath her frayed coat. A ragged, tearing sound ripped from her throat, a sob built on weeks of terror, starvation, and the crushing weight of failing her child. It was the sound of a spring snapping after being wound far too tight. Carrie immediately dropped to her knees beside her mother. The little girl wrapped her small arms around Selena's neck, pressing her messy blonde head against her mother's shoulder. Carrie wasn't crying. She was just holding on, her small face solemn and deeply understanding. Behind the ice machine, Ayan squeezed his eyes shut. His jaw ached from how hard he was clenching his teeth. The sound of the woman sobbing clawed at his insides, twisting that uncomfortable knot in his chest tighter and tighter. He hated it. He hated the vulnerability. He hated being a witness to someone else's absolute rock bottom. But more than that, he hated the realization that washed over him in the cold, damp shadows. A cup of coffee costs $2.85. Rent costs $400. Groceries cost $68. But as Ayan listened to the mother and daughter on the concrete walkway, he realized the horrifying truth. The ledger wasn't balanced. It wasn't even close. He was still in debt, because what that little girl had actually given him at the diner wasn't coffee. It was a mirror, and Ayan was terrified of the man he saw looking back. The heavy steel gates of the clubhouse rolled back with a loud metallic shriek. Ayan idled the road king through the gap, the tires crunching over the gravel driveway. The compound was exactly as he had left it yesterday, a fortified concrete bunker masquerading as a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. Inside, the air hit him like a physical blow. It was a thick, suffocating soup of cheap weed, stale keg beer, and the acrid smoke of a dozen cigarettes burning in tin ashtrays. The bass from the jukebox thumped through the floorboards, a heavy southern rock track that vibrated in his teeth. Usually, this was a sanctuary. The smells, the noise, the rough laughter echoing from the pool table. It was the environment he had chosen, the ecosystem where he was an apex predator. Today, it just felt loud. He walked past a group of younger prospects hauling cases of beer toward the walk-in cooler. They moved out of his way with hurried nods of respect. Ayan barely acknowledged them. He went straight to the heavy oak bar, dropped his heavy leather cut onto a stool, and poured himself 3 fingers of cheap bourbon from a bottle kept under the counter. He swallowed it neat. The burn was immediate, searing down his throat and pooling warmly in his stomach. It didn't help. Garrett, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, slid onto the stool next to him. Garrett was missing half his left ear and had a spiderweb tattooed across his throat. He smelled of motor oil and old leather. "You look like you swallowed a brick, Ox," Garrett grunted, signaling the bartender for his own glass. "Where you been? You missed church." Church, the weekly club meeting. Ayan hadn't missed a mandatory meeting in 6 years. "Riding," Ayan said. The lie was flat, devoid of effort. Garrett paused, his glass halfway to his mouth. He looked at Ayan, his dark eyes sweeping over the older man's tense jaw and the rigid set of his shoulders. "Riding in this shit? With your knee?" "Right. Look, if it's the Bakersfield thing creeping up again. It ain't Bakersfield, Ayan snapped. He poured himself another 3 fingers, his hand surprisingly steady despite the chaotic buzzing in his skull. Just needed air. Garrett backed off, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Your business is your business, brother. Just saying, you need a heavy hand. You know where to look. Ayan nodded curtly, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. A heavy hand. That was all he had. For 30 years, every problem in his life had been solved with intimidation, leverage, or blunt force. He looked down at his massive hands resting on the sticky bar top. The knuckles were a roadmap of calcified bone breaks and thick, white scar tissue. These were hands meant for tearing things down. Yet 3 hours ago, those same hands had been agonizingly careful not to crush a loaf of cheap white bread. The contradiction made him feel physically ill. He pushed the bourbon away, standing up so fast the stool scraped harshly against the floor. He needed to fix this. He needed to compartmentalize the situation, solve the equation, and get the ledger back to zero. A cup of coffee, a month of rent, a pile of groceries. It still wasn't enough because he still didn't know the full variable. He walked to the back office, shutting the heavy fire door behind him, cutting the jukebox down to a dull thud. He pulled a burner phone from the bottom drawer of a dented filing cabinet. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 2 years. Yeah? The voice on the other end was reedy, nasal. Miller, Ayan rumbled. It's Ox. A pause. Jesus, Ox, it's been a minute. I thought we were square after the title transfers in Reno. We are. This is a new favor. I need information, and I need it an hour ago. I'm off the clock at the precinct, Ox. Running plates right now will flag my terminal. Not plates, Ayan said, pacing the small office, his boots thudding against the cheap carpet. A name. Selena. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Has a kid, daughter named Carrie, about 7. They're holed up at the Street Winds Motel out on Route 9. I need to know why she's hiding in a roach motel in the freezing rain. Miller sighed, the sound crackling over the cheap speaker. Give me 20 minutes. It took 35. When the phone finally vibrated in Ayan's palm, he answered it before the second ring. Got her, Miller said. Selena Black. Used to live out in Bellevue. Clean record, not even a parking ticket. But the system is lit up with domestic disturbance calls to her old address over the last 3 years. Yisur Shimain, Ayan stopped pacing. The muscles in his neck tightened. Who? Guy named Richard Hayes, ex-boyfriend. He's got a sheet longer than my arm. Aggravated assault, extortion, possession with intent. He's muscle for the local sports book. Looks like she finally filed a restraining order 3 weeks ago. 2 days later, her bank accounts were completely drained. Her car was reported stolen, probably by him, and she vanished. Tiffy, is he looking for her? He's got the local PD looking for her, Miller corrected, his voice dropping an octave. He filed a missing persons report for the kid, claimed custodial interference. Because he's got friends in the department, they're actively searching. If a patrol car runs her ID, they'll pop her and hand the kid right back to him. A cold, heavy stone settled in Ayan's gut. This wasn't just poverty. This was a hunt. Selena hadn't just hit a string of bad luck. She had been systematically dismantled, stripped of her resources, and cornered, and the man doing it had the law in his pocket. Thanks, Miller, Ayan said softly. Ox, listen to me, Miller warned. Hayes is connected to the outfit running the docks. You touch him, you're not just stepping on a domestic abuser. You're stepping on a hornet's nest. Tell me this ain't club business. It ain't club business, Ayan said. He hung up, tossing the plastic phone onto the desk. Anger, pure and white-hot, finally flared in his chest. This, he understood. This was the currency he dealt in. He didn't know how to handle a little girl's generosity, but he knew exactly how to handle a man who beat women and weaponized the police. He walked out of the office, grabbed his leather cut from the bar, and shoved his arms through the sleeves. The heavy leather felt like armor. He didn't look at Garrett. He didn't look at anyone. The ledger was about to get bloody. The rain had finally stopped by the next morning, replaced by a bitter, biting cold that turned the puddles in the motel parking lot to sheets of dirty glass. Ayan didn't park down the block this time. He rode the massive Harley right into the street winds lot, ignoring the deep potholes, and killed the engine directly in front of room 114. The roar of the pipes echoed off the rotting stucco, a deliberate, aggressive announcement of his arrival. He wanted the manager to look out the window. He wanted anyone watching to see him. He dismounted, the cold air immediately biting at his exposed face. His bad knee protested fiercely as it took his weight, but he ignored it. He walked to the peeling teal door and knocked. 3 heavy, authoritative thuds. He heard the immediate scuffling of feet inside. Then, silence. A heavy, terrified silence. "Open the door, Selena," Ayan said. His voice was a low rumble, designed to penetrate the cheap wood without carrying across the parking lot. "I ain't the cops." He heard a metallic scrape. The door opened a fraction of an inch, stopping short against a thick brass security chain. Through the narrow gap, he saw Selena's eye. It was bloodshot, surrounded by dark, bruised-looking skin. The raw terror in her gaze made Ayan shift his weight uncomfortably. "Ooh, who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" Before Ayan could answer, a small face appeared in the gap below Selena's arm. Carrie. She wasn't wearing the pink jacket today, just a faded yellow t-shirt that hung loosely over her narrow frame. "It's the coffee man," Carrie said. Her voice held zero fear, just a factual observation. Selena looked down at her daughter, then back up at Ayan, confusion briefly cutting through her panic. "The what?" "Let me in," Ayan said, "before you freeze us both to death." Selena hesitated. Her survival instincts were screaming at her to slam the door, but she looked at the sheer size of him. She knew that if he wanted to come in, that flimsy brass chain wouldn't slow him down for a second. With a trembling hand, she slid the chain free and pulled the door open. Ayan stepped inside. The room was stiflingly hot. The wall heater cranked to its maximum setting, humming aggressively. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke permanently baked into the carpet, mixed with the sharp, artificial scent of the canned beef stew he had bought them. The room was microscopic. A single queen bed took up most of the space, the faded floral bedspread wrinkled and stained. Ayan's broad shoulders seemed to touch both walls. He felt like a caged bear. Selena backed up until the backs of her knees hit the mattress. She pulled Carrie flush against her leg, shielding the girl with her body. "The manager said a church voucher paid our rent," Selena said, her voice shaking badly. Her eyes darted to the club patches on Ayan's leather vest. "You're not from a church." "Manager's an idiot," Ayan said bluntly. He didn't smile. He didn't try to soften his voice. He just stood there, a towering monolith of bad news. "I paid it. I bought the groceries." "Why?" Selena asked, her breathing shallow. "We don't have anything. We don't have money to pay you back. Whatever you want." "I don't want your money." Ayan cut her off, irritated by the assumption, even though he knew it was entirely logical. He looked down at Carrie. The little girl was staring at his heavy boots. "Your kid paid my tab at the diner. I don't like owing debts. I paid it back. We're square." Selena stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. You paid $400 in rent because of a $3 coffee?" "I'm bad at math," Ayan deadpanned. He didn't wait for her to process it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper he'd written on earlier that morning. He tossed it onto the small laminate nightstand. "Richard Hayes," Ayan said. The name hit Selena like a physical strike. She violently flinched, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The little color left in her face drained away completely, leaving her looking like a corpse. Carrie looked up at her mother, feeling the sudden rigid tension in the woman's body. "How do you know that name?" Selena breathed, her eyes wide with a fresh, deeper kind of terror. I know he drained your accounts, Ayan continued, his voice relentless, devoid of pity. Pity was useless. I know he filed a false missing persons report on Carrie. I know he's got the local PD looking for your license plates, which is why you're walking in the rain instead of driving. Cha. Selina collapsed onto the edge of the bed. She didn't cry. The fear was too absolute for tears. Did he send you? She whispered, staring at the stained carpet. Are you here to take her? Ayan scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. If Hayes sent me, you'd already be in the trunk of a car. No, he didn't send me, but he's going to find you. You can't stay here. The manager is a rat. The second someone flashes $50 in his face, he'll hand over your room key. I have nowhere else to go, Selina said, her voice cracking. My family is gone. My friends are terrified of him. The police, the officer who took my initial report plays softball with Richard every Sunday. She finally looked up at Ayan, her eyes completely hollowed out. He told me if I ever tried to leave, he wouldn't kill me. He'd just take Carrie and make sure I lived a long time without her. Ayan felt the muscles in his jaw lock. He looked at the little girl. Carrie was still watching him, her pale blue eyes tracking his movements. She wasn't crying. She was too used to this. That realization pissed him off more than anything else. A 7-year-old who knew how to stay quiet when the world was ending. He pulled out the flimsy wooden chair from the motel desk and sat down. The chair groaned under his massive weight, his bad knee popping loudly in the quiet room. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on his thighs. He looked Selina dead in the eye. He didn't offer comfort. He offered reality. You're right. You can't go to the cops, Ayan said smoothly. And you can't run, because running takes money, and he took all yours. Selina wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. Then what do I do? Ayan let the silence stretch for a long moment. The humming of the heater suddenly sounded like a countdown. He knew exactly what he was about to do, and he knew it was a betrayal of everything his club stood for. He was inviting chaos into his life for a stranger. But he looked at the little girl who had given him her last dollar when he had empty pockets. He reached into his jacket. You pack your bags, Ayan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. I'm moving you. Ayan didn't put them on the motorcycle. He left Selina packing whatever meager belongings she had into 2 black garbage bags and rode the Harley back to the clubhouse. He bypassed the bar, ignored Garrett's questioning stare, and walked straight to the gravel lot out back. Parked deep in the weeds was a primer gray 1998 Ford F-150. It was a club beater, used for hauling kegs and moving questionable cargo at ungodly hours. The heater was broken, stuck on a permanent, suffocating blast of hot air, and the cab smelled of stale grease and wet dog. He drove it back to the street winds. Selina and Carrie were waiting on the concrete walkway. They climbed in without a word, the heavy doors slamming shut with a hollow metallic rattle. The drive was agonizingly silent. The broken heater roared, cooking the small cabin. Ayan drove with the windows cracked, the freezing wind whipping across his face, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat radiating from the dashboard. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, tracking every set of headlights that lingered too long behind them. He drove them out of the city limits, past the skeletal remains of closed factories, and deep into the county where the streetlights died out. He pulled off a 2-lane highway and rumbled down a dirt access road overgrown with dead blackberry bushes. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a low cinder block building with a corrugated tin roof. Faded letters painted directly onto the brick read D&M Upholstery. It had belonged to his sponsor in the club, a man dead 10 years now. Ayan paid the property taxes in cash every spring and used it to store motorcycle frames and ghosts. Ayan killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy. He unlocked the heavy steel padlock on the front door and pushed it open. He reached inside and flipped a breaker switch. A row of industrial fluorescent lights flickered to life, buzzing like angry hornets. He walked the women inside. The air was dry and smelled strongly of sawdust, old canvas, and dried contact cement. The front room was an office with a battered metal desk and a filthy couch. The back was a sprawling warehouse space filled with rolling tables, industrial sewing machines, and towering racks of rolled fabric. "It's not the Ritz," Ion said, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. "But the property is under a dead man's name, no cameras on the road, no neighbors for 2 miles. Hayes won't look here, and neither will his cop buddies." Selena dropped the garbage bags onto the concrete floor. She looked around the cavernous, dusty space. She didn't complain about the cold or the dirt. She just looked deeply, profoundly exhausted. "How long?" she asked. "Until I fix it," Ion replied. He walked to a rusted utility sink in the corner and turned the tap. The pipe shuddered, spitting rusty brown water for a full minute before it ran clear. He pointed to a small wooden door near the back. "Bathroom is in there. Hot water heater works, but you got to give it 20 minutes to cycle. I'll bring cots and space heaters tomorrow." He turned to leave. He wanted to be out of this building. The walls felt like they were closing in, thick with the domestic vulnerability he couldn't stomach. "Wait!" a small voice piped up. Ion stopped, his hand resting on the heavy metal door frame. He looked down. Carrie had unzipped her oversized pink jacket. She reached into the front pocket of her jeans and pulled her hand out, holding it closed into a small fist. She walked up to him, stopping right at the steel toes of his boots. She held her hand out and uncurled her fingers. Sitting on her dirty palm was a piece of hard butterscotch candy. The yellow wrapper was twisted tight, slightly sticky, and covered in a fine layer of pocket lint. "For the ride," she said flatly. Ion stared at the candy. His chest tightened, a sharp physical pain that made it hard to draw breath. He wanted to tell her to keep it. He wanted to explain that the world was a brutal, unforgiving meat grinder that didn't care about butterscotch candies. He wanted to yell. Instead, his massive, scarred hand reached down. His thick fingers, calloused from years of gripping throttles and breaking jaws, delicately pinched the candy from her palm. He put it in his heavy leather jacket pocket. "Thanks, kid," he muttered. He walked out into the freezing night, locking the heavy steel door behind him. He stood in the dirt driveway for a long moment, the cold biting through his jeans. He pulled the butterscotch from his pocket, unwrapped it, and put it in his mouth. It tasted like artificial sugar and dust. He chewed it to pieces, the hard candy cracking loudly in his jaw. Then he got into the truck to hunt down a ghost. Richard Hayes was not a hard man to find if you knew which rocks to kick over. The local sports book ran its operations out of the back room of a dive bar called the Rusty Anchor, a windowless brick building situated uncomfortably close to the shipping docks. Ion didn't drive the truck. He swapped it for his Harley back at the clubhouse. He wanted Hayes to hear him coming. He wanted the intimidation factor dialed to the absolute maximum. He parked the road cane directly on the cracked sidewalk in front of the bar's entrance, ignoring the no parking sign bolted to the brick. He walked in. The bar smelled of cheap draft beer, piss, and fried onions. The lighting was dismal, casting long, dark shadows across the scuffed linoleum. The jukebox was playing a low, mournful country song. 3 men sat at the bar, nursing pints. Ion ignored them. He walked straight past the taps, his heavy boots thudding rhythmically, and headed for the reinforced steel door at the back. A bouncer, a thick-necked kid in a tight black t-shirt, stepped into his path, crossing his arms. "Private party, old man," the kid said, puffing his chest out. Ion didn't break stride. He reached out with his left hand, grabbed the kid by the throat of his shirt, and violently slammed him sideways into the drywall. The plaster cracked under the impact. Before the kid could react, Ion's right fist buried itself deep into his solar plexus. All the air left the bouncer's lungs in a wet hiss. He dropped to his knees, gasping like a landed fish. Ion kicked the steel door open. The back room was thick with cigar smoke. 4 men sat around a folding card table covered in cash and handwritten ledgers. Richard Hayes was easy to spot. He matched Miller's description perfectly. Slicked back hair, a sharp jawline, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than Ayan's motorcycle. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption, a lit cigar pinched between his fingers. The room went dead silent. The three other men, recognizing the winged death head patch on Ayan's leather cut, slowly moved their hands above the table, palms flat against the felt. Nobody wanted a war with the angels over a backroom bookie operation. Hayes, Ayan grumbled. The name sounded like gravel caught in a brake caliper. Hayes squinted, trying to maintain his slick composure. Who's asking? Ayan crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't monologue. He didn't issue a warning. He grabbed a fistful of Hayes's expensive suit jacket and hauled the man out of his folding chair, throwing him violently backward. Hayes crashed into a filing cabinet, the heavy metal denting under his weight. Before Hayes could scramble up, Ayan was on him. He pressed his heavy steel-toed boot squarely onto the center of Hayes's chest, pinning him to the filthy linoleum floor. "Hey, hey!" one of the other men yelled, finally finding his voice. "He works for the docks. You can't just—" Ayan turned his head, fixing the man with a stare so cold and devoid of humanity that the man choked on his own words. "I ain't here for club business. I'm here on a personal errand. Anyone who steps off that table gets their kneecaps inverted. Understand?" Nobody moved. Ayan looked back down at Hayes. The slick confidence was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed terror of a man who suddenly realized he was no longer the apex predator in the room. He smelled strongly of fear and expensive cologne. "Selina and the kid," Ayan said softly, leaning his weight into his boot. Hayes gasped, the pressure on his sternum making it impossible to draw a full breath. "You're done looking for them." You don't know what you're talking about," Hayes wheezed, his hands clawing uselessly at Ayan's boot. "She took my kid." "I know you drained her bank accounts," Ayan said, his voice a steady, terrifying drone. "I know you beat her. I know you got a buddy in the precinct running her plates." Ayan slowly reached into his cut. Hayes flinched, bracing for a knife or a gun. Instead, Ayan pulled out his heavy, steel-cased Zippo lighter. He flipped the lid open with a sharp clink and struck the flint. The yellow flame cast dancing shadows across Ayan's heavily scarred face. "You're going to call your cop buddy tonight," Ayan instructed, lowering the flame until it was an inch from Hayes's right eye. "You're going to tell him you found the kid with her grandparents down in Oregon and to cancel the missing persons report. Then you're going to forget Selina Black ever existed." My bosses... Hayes tried to bluff, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Your bosses don't care about your ex-girlfriend," Ayan interrupted, snapping the Zippo shut. The sudden darkness felt heavier. "They care about the money on that table. If I have to come back here, I won't come alone, and I will burn this entire operation to the concrete just to roast you in the middle of it." Ayan shifted his weight off Hayes's chest, planting his boot directly onto Hayes's right hand. He didn't stomp. He just leaned his 260 pounds onto his heel. The wet, sickening crunch of breaking metacarpals echoed loudly in the small room. Hayes screamed, a high, piercing wail that tore from his throat as his fingers flattened against the floor. Ayan stepped back, watching the man writhe on the ground, clutching his mangled hand to his chest. There was no joy in it. There was no righteous vindication. It was just violence, plain and simple. The ugly, necessary currency of his life. "That's to remind you," Ayan said, turning his back on the crying man. He walked out of the back room, through the bar, and out into the biting, cold night. He climbed onto his Harley, the engine roaring to life beneath him. As he rode away from the docks, the freezing wind whipping at his face, he realized the knot in his chest was gone. He rode back to the upholstery shop. The lights were out. He killed the engine at the end of the dirt road and walked the rest of the way in the dark, not wanting to wake them. He slipped a thick envelope under the steel door. Inside was the $3,000 he had kept in his bail fund, along with a note detailing a safe route out of state and the contact number for a mechanic in Montana who owed Ayan a favor and needed a secretary. Ayan stood in the quiet darkness, listening to the wind rattle the corrugated tin roof. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt old, tired, and deeply flawed. He had traded his violence for a 7-year-old's copper pennies. It was a terrible exchange rate, but for the first time in 30 years, Ayan's ledger was balanced. He turned around and walked back down the dirt road alone. If this story struck a chord with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that humanity can be found in the darkest, most unexpected places. It helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you deep, grounded stories about real resilience and imperfect redemption. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new release. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Ayan's shoes? Thanks for watching, and ride safe out there.